Welcome, everyone. My name is Klaus Weber. I'm the Deputy Director of the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And I welcome you to our webinar series, which is titled Building Sustainable Futures, Global Challenges and Possibilities. This is a series that we run throughout the year by every other week, where we consider different United Nations Sustainable Development Goals each quarter as a foil, as a starting point to explore important global issues. This fall, our series focuses on SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions. And our previous sessions and today's sessions, I think, will be similar. We have sought to take the idea of strong institutions seriously and expand it by looking at the two-faced nature of institutions that can work against as much as in favor of peace and justice. So we've touched on institutional white supremacy, white sovereignty in the US and the world, everyday insecurity of institutional crisis in the Middle East, and we compared institutions of democratic voice in the Ukraine and the US in previous sessions. Today's speakers continue in this vein, considering justice and institutions around Islamophobia. And though Islamophobia in the United States is often cast as the result of the aftershock of 9/11, it actually has a long history, and the category gained prominence in particular at the beginning of the 20th century at the height of white supremacy and with the ascent of it. And our speakers ask us to understand Islamophobia as a form of racism and contribute that analysis to our understanding of it. So I'm very honored and really pleased to welcome back Dr. Barnor Hesse and also introduce Dr. Salman Sayyid, who will help us reflect upon the history and the globality of Islamophobia. Barnor Hesse is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern. His research and teaching is in the areas of Black political thought and critical race studies. Salman Sayyid is a professor of social theory and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. And he explores how societies have formed and developed through history. In particular, he studies racism's role in the formation of modern societies, alternative worldviews signaled by various forms of Islamist projects, and the way that rhetoric contributes to the formation of collective identities. So I'm very excited about this panel. I think we will hear important insights on a critical issue. And so welcome, Dr. Hesse and Dr. Sayyid. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I think I'll turn it over to Barnor first, correct?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'd like to welcome Dr. Salman Sayyid back to Northwestern. I think you were here about 10 years ago, if I recall correctly. Would that be right? Yeah.
You're on mute.
Seem to be on mute. You seem to be on mute. You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
No.
I think you just did. Okay, so let me do that again. In fact, I was actually saying some nice things about you while you were on mute. So we were here about 10 years ago. I think you came to Northwestern, if I can recall correctly. Remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that we've known each other a long time as friends and colleagues. We've been talking about these kinds of issues for over 20 years. And I think when we were putting this conversation together, the key concern was the fact that Islamophobia is a concept which is so highly contested that it seems always useful to try and unpack what that means. It probably has more traction in Europe, even though it's highly contested, than it does in the US. So I thought it might be useful to begin with looking at this infographic that I know that you constructed a few years ago to get us into the conversation. So if we could look at that infographic now, please. So I thought I might say a couple of things about this infographic and then come back to you, Salman, for a conversation about it. Islamophobia, people's definition, I think we can see a couple of things here that's very useful for us to take away. The first is that Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets the expression of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness And this is something I want to talk to you about when we finish looking at this, but I probably should say something about the term racism and the term race. I think in this context, when we're thinking about racism, we're thinking about the creation of hierarchies and segregations between white and non-white populations, in which the non-white populations are racially profiled for punitive treatment, particularly if they transgress those hierarchies and segregations. Now, it's often said once you introduce the idea of racism and Islamophobia as a form of racism, there's often a commonsensical retort that Muslims are not a race.
Yeah.
So we need to say something about that retort. Muslims are not a race, but they are treated as one. So what does that mean? Well, it means that in a general sense, no populations are races in the discredited biological sense of the term. But in the modern world over the last 500 years, as a result of settler colonialism, racial slavery, and empire, populations across the world have been constructed as white and non-white races. So if I can come back to you, Salman, we can stop looking at the infographic now. What I'm interested to get you to talk about is what ideas motivated the production of that infographic, and how do you think this advances the idea about what Islamophobia is?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you from Klaus Weber and everyone for setting this event up. I think it's really important to fix upon one thing I started off with. There is still a racist conception of racism which operates in more places than it should. And by that I mean is that the narrative around racism, which is most commonly held and continues to be held, and not just in sort of common circle, but in many, many non-specialized academic circles, in policy circles, it goes something like this: that racism is a response to the existence of objective, whether races are considered to be biological entities or cultural entities is nowadays a bit more loose, but it is that races objectively exist, they are visibly marked, and that then leads to racism. In a sense, racism is a natural response to the existence of racism. So one of the challenges that the idea of Islamophobia as racism immediately faces is going against this kind of racist conception of the existence of races in the first place. So the first thing that they do is try and demonstrate in a publicly accessible way the difficulty of thinking race as almost as natural, as basically being contained within sort of typical phenotypical markers in different kinds of locales. So it's really trying to describe the process of racialization. And behind that is the idea that what you have now is really, we're witnessing the racialization of Muslimness. And there are many, many examples of that, but one of the most common ones is, and many Muslims share this, is that flying while being Muslim. So if you go through airport security, there's a whole panoply of measures that have been invented that now circulate, which are able to identify or try to identify Muslims. You have trainings, you have workshops, all of these things, how to find out what a Muslim is and what are the markers for that. So that's the first kind of element of what the infographic was trying to do, was to say that you do not need a fixed or sedimented category of race as a way of understanding racism. In fact, racism races. It constitutes the category of race that then applies to the social world. So I think that was the first and most important aspect of this, that to try to get the idea across that the fact that up till this point of Islamophobia, the notion of Muslims constituting any kind of distinct racial or ethnic or national group, there's no kind of attempt to think about Muslimness in that way. What you've seen for the last 50 odd years is increasing sense of something called Muslimness, which can be identified, a variety of markers which now circulate in a broad cultural context.
I think one of the things that's interesting about that background is across the same period of over the last 50 years, you've seen in Western societies the movement from a biological racism to a cultural racism. So there's a way in which the question of race was always assembled through various different signifiers: the body, religion, territory, aesthetics, and so on. So in that sense, you know, prior to Islamophobia, many of the populations experiencing this kind of racism would have been experiencing the old biological racism through migration and so on. Simply the argument has changed. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think one of the arguments I would make, and I've made elsewhere, is this: the one way to think about Islamophobia as racism is a kind of a race or post-racial times. And what I mean by post-racial here is not the end of racism so much, but certainly an end or a displacement of a particular biological system which was hegemonic up till, I would say, you know, probably until 1945, in a sense, within the global north at least. So I think part of the Islamophobia is really the reoccupation of many kind of biological racism categories, but then you can say, well, they're not racism because it's not biology. So one of the big things comes about it is that, can't be racist against Muslims because it's a matter of choice. Or you can't, it's not really racism when you do these sorts of things. So take, for example, various kinds of invectives or various kinds of ways of talking about Muslims, which if you scrubbed out the name Muslim and put in another ethnic designation or label there, or another racially marked label, you would identify immediately as being racist. But when it comes to Muslims, it is possible to say, well, it's not really racism because we're not talking about race, we're talking about religion. Not, of course, recognizing that people are not really talking about religion. Islamophobia is not a logical position. It has bits of it there, but the distinction or the kind of subject, those subject to Islamophobia are rarely subject to a theological dispute. When, you know, someone is attacked on the bus or someone's attacked in the street, it's not at the end of a theological dispute, the Prophet or the Trinity. Rarely do those marks come out of people's mouths when they're actually doing these actions. So I think it's important for us to recognize that what we're seeing with Islamophobia is the formation of a racialized community, a racialized group, in the context of abandoning certain types of racial, determined kind of racial.
Okay, so I think that's a useful set of statements to characterize what we're trying to examine here. And as you know, we're sort of very interested in the conceptualization of these kinds of ideas. So I want us to try and see if we can unpack a little further. Clearly, in the popular mind, when we hear about sort of Muslims being reviled and pathologized, there's this dominant image of a bearded, brown-skinned man who is associated with terrorism. But it's very interesting that on the street every day, a high proportion of people who are victimized by Islamophobia are women. So I want us to look at the next video that we have lined up, which is about the gendered Islamophobia, and then come back and have a conversation about that.
31% of young children think that Muslims are taking over the country. 56% believe that Islam is a threat to Western liberal democracy. I was attacked when I was walking home from school, where a group of girls ripped off my hijab and called me derogatory words. When I was at university, I had lectures saying that Muslims who fully believe in their faith shouldn't be allowed entry into university. Gendered Islamophobia is the experience that Muslim women have being at the intersections of two different identities, so being women and being Muslim. A lot of Islamophobia, the way that it is produced, the way that it is packaged, is often targeted towards women. And this is because of their dress. This is because of this idea that Muslim women are oppressed by people in their own community, this idea that there is an extra level of misogyny within Muslim communities, all of which does not make sense. These attacks are highly personalized. They depend on people making an identification of Muslim women and then targeting them and punishing them for their identity. Women in West Yorkshire who wear the niqab have had letters threatening acid attacks sent through their letterboxes. Boris Johnson has penned articles comparing them to letterboxes. This dehumanization and erosion of a Muslim woman's right to exist in public space is a perfect example of the kind of gendered Islamophobia that we face in society. Muslim women have long witnessed their choice of dress being dragged into national conversations, being debated without them. In a mix of sexist and racist commentary, the far right have always exploited Muslim women and their issues in order to gain further ground. This strain of gendered Islamophobia tries to convince Muslim women that their bodies belong not to themselves but to others to liberate. Whether this takes the historic form of public unveiling ceremonies in colonial Algeria, whether it's the protests that the EDL bring to the cities like Bradford, whether it's articles in newspapers calling the niqab oppressive, the message is very clear. We can't ignore how politicians and media fuel hate crime. Research has consistently shown that a binary image of Muslim women in public discourse creates a fertile ground for discrimination. This pits Islam on one side and women's rights on the other, with Muslim women torn in the middle. From 1999 to 2013, one Danish journalist concluded that the majority of stories about Muslim women focused around negative images, things like female genital mutilation, things like honor killings, social control, things like forced wearing of headscarves. And what is this media image, these binaries that Muslim women are presented in? Well, we're either oppressed or we're complicit in our own oppression. We're either completely banished and removed from Muslim civil society, or we're hyper-visible in our niqabs and our cloaks and targets for attacks. We are either traditionally submissive or we are too loud when we talk about our oppression. But we are always in need of liberation. Funding is really, really important. We need Muslim communities to be able to feel safe, and for mosques, which are designated open spaces for prayer for anyone to come and use. These kinds of spaces need to be able to be protected from the kinds of threats that they are currently facing. We've seen 6 mosques, defaced and broken into in Birmingham. We've seen it happen in Newcastle. We've seen it happen in Belfast. It is across the country.
Okay, so seeing there in that video an indication of how global Islamophobia is and its gender specificity. It's worth pointing out that was about England, but we could have been talking about France, we could have been talking about Australia, and we certainly could be talking about the US. So I wonder, in that kind of quotidian everydayness of Islamophobia, what do you think is at stake in a video like this? Clearly, the point you made earlier on about this is not a theological dispute. This is about actual physical violence and degrading people in an everyday situation. What do you see are the issues at stake here?
I mean, I think there are many issues there, but what I think, and I think it takes from what the video says, is one of the key things is the sense of scandal with the appearance of visibly marked Muslim women. And the idea is twofold. One is there's a kind of a progressive narrative about which underwrites a lot of Western supremacy. The whole world will become Westernized. And that, in a sense, that consumption, that final consumption, that kind of trajectory, because the West has discovered the best way of life, and eventually it will prevail throughout the earth narrative. And it has both cultural and popular effects and things like that, as well as kind of policy effects. But in that narrative, there's also then a sense that the Western discovery feminism, that the West is marked by with a kind of proliferation of rights, proliferation of freedoms, and one of the key freedoms is the kind of advance on women's rights. So when you have the existence of Muslim women who, within Western society, choose to mark themselves off in different ways as it's presented, then it becomes a problem. How do you explain this? How do you account for that? And what does that say about the narrative around future Westernization of the world? So I think there's one kind of element that comes in regularly in all of this, is the presence of Muslim public spaces or presence of Muslim women, visibly marked Muslim women in different places as marking a certain kind of presence. And you see that in many of the campaigns around trying to regulate Muslim and their choices, etc. And this has got a long kind of antiquity. And certainly in terms of one of the distinguishing features of Islamophobia is to the extent in which it is written on the bodies of Muslim women, of the state, and institutions which often make regulation of Muslim women's conduct through their apparel as one of the main kind of institutional devices of Islamophobia often, plus through the street violence that they often find in cases of hijabs being ripped off, etc., etc. So you have to think about what is actually ripping off the hijab or the kind of marking out of that is trying to do. And I would argue that it's trying to restore a certain sense of homogeneity, a certain sense of whiteness as complete, which these women interrupting around the progressive narrative. So I think that's one of the key elements of that.
And you see also, and it's very sort of similar to Black experiences of racism, and let's not forget many Black people are Muslim, but you see this control of public space, as if only certain kinds of representations of people or certain symbolizations of people can occupy the public space, and that public space is regulated heavily by white people or people induced by Western ideas of pathologizing Muslims. I also noticed the old trope of the white savior complex. Maybe you want to say something a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most notorious examples of this is the way that imperialism is directly imperialist interventions have been justified by trying to rescue brown women, or rescue Muslim women in the specific cases. And this is not just to go back to the which wasn't really way back when the empires, but you can see, for example, the relatively recent intervention in Afghanistan with the United States, and there was a whole effort that the United States is going there to bring to save Afghani women. And one argument would be, we'll talk about the hypocrisy of that, or how, and in relation to what they're not doing. But the real issue about that is the notion that women, Muslim women, do not have agency, which predicates the necessity for this external intervention. Here, the savior comes in to provide agency. Now, anyone who's worked on relations of questions of racism broadly can detect this trope in so many kind of aspects, from the kind of popular culture, from stories about Robinson Crusoe, from the idea of the native informant. All of these kinds of things play into that, the idea of the white savior presenting agency to those who lack agency. And that's also, of course, the narrative around a lot of the ways that the anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggles was presented, is that it is only through the learning from the Enlightenment, etc., which made these people able to resist empire, etc. So I think one of the key elements here of the white savior is to the justification of the exercise of regulatory power. So one of the ways is that we're not really exercising, really regulating others, we are actually liberating them. And that, it seems to me, is really, really crucial to Islamophobia, but also just to the exercise of a certain kind of imperium, which feels at the heart of it, it is a liberatory, emancipatory project. And it's just that these people don't realize they're being emancipated.
But surely, I'm going to push back a little bit. You know, I'm only playing devil's advocate. But surely, also, I'm sorry, you're pushing back before I push back. But surely at the heart of
really well, but
Islamophobia is a critique of Islam. And what really interests me here is why the critique of Islam? I mean, let me just sort of introduce this. I mean, we know in Western popular culture, there's this linkage now fixed between terrorist bombings and so-called Muslim fanatics that constantly, particularly in this country, repeats the symbols of 9/11, but always outside of any context of history, of politics, of international law. How do we unpack that kind of critique?
I think there's two things here I would make a point about. Firstly, the idea of violence as a response to prior violence is quite standard. If you look within sort of discriminatory practices, if you look at, for example, anti-Semitism in the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, it was often justified in relation to the existence of anarchist, Bolshevik, criminals which were considered to be marked off as being Jewish. So in a sense, it was really a response to that. If you think about the violence meted out to populations of African diaspora, they're often in relation to a prior violence that is supposed to have, which is to prevent the violence of those populations, or a response to their violence rather than initiating the violence. So that's the first aspect of this, that a lot of it is simply, like you said, a decontextualization of how we got here, decontextualization of the kind of the systemic violations and only the recognition of violence. So I think that's one of the things that plays out. I would push back to you on the relationship of whether this, to what extent Islam is really the heart of Islamophobia. It seems to me that what you have at the heart of Islamophobia is a unease or an attack on Muslimness, which sort of is really located either in Islam or in Muslims. It sort of transcends the two. To give you a very simple and straightforward example, the first person who was killed in the United States in response to 9/11 wasn't a Muslim. He happened to be a bearded man with a turban who was assumed to be a Muslim. And this is not a one-off phenomenon in a way. So in a sense, that wasn't a kind of an issue about what, no one asked him what he believed in, what he did not believe in, etc. It was simply a certain kind of assumption about certain kinds of markers. Now, having said that, there is no doubt there is a kind of mobilization of tropes from some of these old, some of them are kind of mobilized, but the heart of it again is the denial of agency. So the argument simply comes this, that anyone can buy the Quran and you can demonstrate that the Quran says X, therefore Muslims X, therefore there's a causal link. And all you need to know about Muslim behavior is to find the appropriate passage in the Quran. It's like Muslims are reduced to some sort of robots that simply work onto their programming. And the biggest example of this is that, after the initial moment after 9/11, there was an upsurge in the sales of the Quran to discover why 9/11 happened. There wasn't an upsurge into sort of critiques of American foreign policy. There wasn't an upsurge into sort of other kinds of anthropological accounts or political accounts or social accounts. It was simply thought that actually, if we found something in the Quran that could justify it. And when you do that, you simply evade any kind of historicity, any kind of historical knowledge, which actually makes the world comprehensible. So the world then simply appears to us these kind of almost kind of a phantoms with no history, who just are there haunting us, and we're unable to wonder why or understand or even to deal with the situation, because we have basically denuded them of any kind of historical possibilities or historical emergence.
And it probably has a lot to do as well, because I think this is an underlying sort of theme of what you're saying. How we talk about violence. It's very interesting the way in which violence gets passed out in terms of justifiable and unjustifiable violence, whatever you position you take on it. I mean, if you look at the history of the US from the African American point of view, violence has been waged against African Americans for over 300, 400 years, largely by white people. And yet in this country, there is this fixity of violence with white people, so much that we need to have a lot of anthropological courses looking into why it is that white people are violent against black people. And you see very similar things throughout the history of colonialism. You know, the history of colonialism was based on violence, but it's not recuperated and remembered as violence. But the reaction to colonialism is violence. And I guess what I'm saying here is, you know, you get your chance to come in a minute, Bobby, but I guess what I'm saying here is that we need to have a very different way of thinking about the question of violence, which allows us to put it in a context before we start apportioning blame. So I noticed you wanted to come in.
No, I mean, I just wanted to agree with you. Is this that we understand violent as an interruption of the mundane, of the routine. What most subjugated populations are experience is a routinized violation, systemic violations over time, and they are somehow completely eradicated as being violent. So in all of those acts, and I'm not just talking about metaphorical violence or microaggressions, I'm talking about systemic violence, which is seen as violent because it is so routinized. And I think that is one of the key points. I mean, take, for example, the very kind of classical definition of state by Max Weber, which talks about this, you know, having a legitimate monopoly over violence. Now, the thing is that whenever you look through political science books, majority of them, when they talk about the monopoly of violence, they will think about violence in terms of no one on groups or no one else being able to exercise, you know, this kind of violence, whereas they will not take into account that kind of everyday violence, domestic violence, violence that is, which we would call crime, violence that exists systemically throughout society, and how that is being regulated. So I think one of the key problems we face, those of us involved in sort of anti-colonial, anti-racial struggles, is to try and educate people into recognizing that colonialism was violence. Racism is violence. And that in itself is a huge, huge. Our narratives of thinking about violence are not structural. So we end up talking about individuals. And then we end up talking about moral categories. And then we end up talking about blame. And then in all of that, we are unable to actually understand the systematicity of those violations, carry on regulating and disfiguring so many people's lives and life opportunities.
Yeah. I think that, I guess part of the background to that might be the way in which the common everyday understanding of racism always systematically disconnects it from colonialism, without which it would have no meaning. And I'm thinking particularly in the way in which in popular culture, because if we examine popular culture these days transnationally, you see daily in news, various different kinds of media, assaults on Muslim populations that have become so casual and so normalized as if to be almost obligatory. I want to get your reaction to this idea of Islamophobia and popular culture after we watch the next video.
There's nothing about what happened in Christchurch today that shocks me. If we're honest, we'll know this has been coming.
White supremacy is on the rise around the world.
Only white people can support what we call Western civilization.
Genocide against the white population, ready to erupt into an all-out race war.
Islam is a disease. We need to vaccinate ourselves against that.
White nationalist figures say white people are under threat because their nations are being invaded.
In a matter of years, Europe, as we know it, will cease to exist. Yet the population of Europe is not declining. Why? Immigration. Islamic immigration.
The enemy, immigration, Black people, Jews, but above all, Muslims.
The subjects of human relations and biases at the weekend, it's thousands.
But it's not just the white nationalist movement. Anti-Muslim bigotry has made its way into popular discourse. Muslims have been otherized as violent and alien in movies and TV series.
Did you see the crazy amount of fertilizer they got stacked up near their garage? That's how they make bombs. What if this is a sleeper cell full of terrorists getting ready to blow up our neighborhood?
Get them all!
One woman will walk in someone else's shoes, disguised as a British Pakistani Muslim.
Doesn't your book say it's okay to kill?
You should just take it off.
And it's not just fictional depictions. Anti-Muslim sentiment has made its way to mainstream media outlets in the US.
Dramatic Muslim invasion, that is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo.
But why is the mother lode of bad ideas?
And into the discourse among political candidates and elected politicians.
I think Islam hates us.
Everything in our power will be done to drive Islam out of this country forever.
The Imam there preached that to the migrants, go into Western Europe, build your enclaves there, breed their women, and do not associate or assimilate into the broader society.
Bigotry has even made its way to legislation. 201 anti-Sharia law bills have been introduced in 43 states in the US since 2010, despite no call for its implementation. Faith-based bans have been implemented all around Europe. And then there are tougher stances on immigration and even tourism.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
The thing that scared me most was when I started reading the manifesto that one of the apparent perpetrators of this attack published. Not because it was deranged, but because it was so familiar.
Sort of, brief representation of the racist assaults against Muslims in popular culture is that it actually marks out the phobia part. There's this extreme moral panic, and I'm looking at references to immigration, which means invasion, white nationalism, which means the fear of white genocide, and there's that whole context there. Why do you think there is such a reaction? And in asking you that question, I know that in your work, you talk about the portrayal of Muslims as fatalists and fanatics. Why is there that kind of, surge of emotion attached to Muslims?
I think that just from that clip, the two things I want to take out from that. One you already mentioned, the notion of genocide against white populations. Yeah, think about this for a minute. This is something which is a trope, which the alt-right and others, but it's become part of this kind of theft of joy, the idea that the immigrants, the ethnically marked, and here the Muslims, that when you have a loss of white privilege, which is what many of the kind of movements for justice throughout the world and throughout the Western plutocracies have argued for, it is not experienced as a loss of privilege. It's actually experienced as a loss itself. So in a way, the white genocide argument seems to suggest that without white privilege, it is not possible to be white. Now that, it seems to me, is a very, very important thing. And I wanted to, and in relation to the other thing I want to talk about very quickly, and I'll go back to this, is Trump talking about Islam hates us. Now, this is not a Trumpism. This is a popular and common trope. The idea of Islam as has emotions like hate or agency like hate. Now, all of these come together to the idea that we've talked about before about Muslims as being conceived of as fatalists. They actually have no agency. They do not do anything. They cannot think. They are simply automatons, and they work through this programming, the Quran. Now, what is interesting about that is one of the main issues, and we've talked about this before, Barnor, many times, is whiteness and white supremacy occupies for itself the possibility of the political. Only it has the possibility of making history. Only it can do its kind of own self is able to generate historical truths and historical transformations. Everyone else has just simply cycles of repetition. They don't bring anything new to the world. So within that is the figure of the Muslim who's unable to think is really, really common, and it circulates. But at the same time, lurking within that is the notion of the excessive transcendental motivation of Muslimness that cannot be contained. And one of the problems here, I think, is why Muslims have begun to circulate in this way. You can argue that the crisis of whiteness is also the crisis of the nation state, which has become one of the main ways in which whiteness expresses itself politically. And Muslimness, which is by definition transnational or global, is more and more difficult to contain the boundaries of the white nation state. Thus, it actually causes this kind of anxiety, which manifests itself both through the metaphors of immigration and metaphor of foreign influences, and the metaphor of basically these people being in the national body, but not being of the nation. And I think that is one of the key components that determine the way that Islamophobia is being played out around the world.
Okay, so now in the minutes that remain, I want to just see if we can draw some of these threads together. Seems to me that maybe we're in a position to refine and elaborate our definition and understanding of Islamophobia. I know that in your work, and I'm going to ask you to say something about this, you've often described Islamophobia as involving the disciplining of Muslimness in relation to a Western horizon. Briefly, how would you explain that?
I think it sort of puts together some of the things I've talked about today. So if you think about, there is a narrative in the world in which modernity or the future orientation of the world is through a certain form of westernization. There's a confusion between modernity and westernization, which I think is explicit. So what prevents modernization is the existence of, at this current juncture, of Muslims who are both considered to be both anti-Western, because this is one of the historical ways in which Westernness expressed itself, but also anti-modern. It is by regulating Muslimness that you can achieve Westernization. And to give you an example of this is that if you look at both the kind of discourses in the People's Republic of China around the Uyghur Muslims, or in India in general, one of the things going on is that these are people who have backward practices, which makes them prone to violence and terrorism, but also prevents them from being fully modernized. And you could say to me, and I'm sure you know, what do you expect the Communist Party of China to be? Not most enlightened. But if you listen very carefully to the narratives that's being spun by Macron and his government in France, it is the same narrative, that we need to regulate these populations so they can become part of our national story and move along with history. So one of the issues here is the question of the regulation is mainly to do with how Muslims are interrupting a westernizing horizon or a westernizing destiny. And that, I think, is one of the ways that Islamophobia is, you could explain Islamophobia through that mechanism.
So I guess my final question, really, given the sort of very abbreviated journey that we've taken in this conversation through the contours of Islamophobia, why is it, do you think, that there's such an opposition to naming these kinds of violations of Muslim people under the term Islamophobia? What is this opposition to the idea of Islamophobia?
I think one of the things we have to understand, Barnor, and you know this as well, that any kind of attempt to deliver on justice, if it's worth anything, will be contested. So, you know, throughout this kind of racism as a category, as a concept, was equally contested. It was contested both in terms of its logical and kind of theoretical inconsistencies and incoherence. It was contested in popular culture because its ramifications would prevent all sorts of social behavior, etc. And in a way, Islamophobia is exactly like that. It is contested. The only difference currently, I would say, with Islamophobia is the way that it circulates globally and the kind of expansion of the circuit where it is being contested. It is being contested precisely because if you accept Islamophobia exists, if you accept that category exists, then you have a harder job to explain certain kinds of protocols and practices which are in play. So in a sense, the contestation of Islamophobia is also a deferment of any kind of ameliorative measures and a kind of holding on to the causes of Islamophobia and the kind of cruelty rather than giving them up and opening up a vista that you may not be able to regulate or control. So I think that is what's really going on. And the dimension that Islamophobia brings into it, and people often say this, that Muslims constitute between a fifth or the quarter of the world's population. And despite COVID, the world is far more connected on that. So you have a situation right now where it's too strong, too expansive to be accommodated in structures and institutions, and but too weak to be accommodated and too kind of strong to be ignored. And that's the tension that we're dealing with right now. That Muslimness is something which marks this kind of transition from perhaps the Western to a post-Western.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sayyid, for your contribution to this conversation. Hopefully we can get into some questions now in the time that remains.
Thank you both. We do have a number of questions. I think some of them connect exactly where the two of you have left off. And I think it's around the question of using racialization as a form of naturalizing oppression and distinctions. And they go to the very heart of the term Islamophobia. So there's several questions around this. One is simply, to what extent do you see the term Islamophobia itself as naturalizing anti-Muslim bias and violence? And, you know, is the term itself, should Muslims actually accept it instead of a term that is maybe less vague and has a different power for resistance?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please. I don't want to answer.
Look, the first thing, there is no pure language, no pure word. So the idea that a lot of the energies of people are spent on the exact word is like some sort of magic spell that will dispel all injustices. I don't think that's really where it's at. So that's the first issue. Secondly, the question about vagueness and that, I think it's part of the contestation. We tend to think that terms which are less vague now were considered to be also very vague. So what you have is really an attempt to dissipate the notion of Islamophobia through the idea of saying, well, there must be a better word for it, like that would actually make any difference fundamentally. It's not, the problem is not the one of the wording. The issue is that it exists in a contested terrain, and whatever word you picked, however precise you were, it would still be contested. So that seems to me a slight red herring about all of this.
Okay. Another sort of set of questions is around the institutionalization of Islamophobia and the who actually does the instituting here. So can you unpack a little bit more, like what processes produce, reproduce, and magnify Islamophobia in present day Western societies?
I think Islamophobia is that it exists both at the level of civil societies and at the level of state. Many measures which are taken and which reproduce it. So, I mean, The Muslim ban is one example of the state intervention. The various anti-Sharia legislation passed in 43 states in the United States, often in states which don't even have a Muslim population to speak of, but they really make sure that there's no possibility of Sharia law, whatever that may mean either. So there is at that level. There is, of course, at the level of popular culture. Now, what I think we need to move away from is the idea of specifically trying to find some kind of coherence among a variety of actors which are working out to a particular kind of plan or not. I think what is created is that you create a certain kind of common sense around Muslimness, which then almost invites these kinds of interventions. And that's where I think the struggle is, to disrupt that common sense, to enable seen as what they are, incredibly, not only incredibly discriminatory, but also self-defeating. And I think that's one of the key moments there, that there are different kinds of agents involved in this, but they are working towards a particular creation of a form of a particular common sense rather than working towards a particular script.
Follow-up question. I'm just sort of scrolling through the questions we got from the audience. If you look at the sort of historical evolution of this and the growth and emergence of it, why has this form of racism crystallized around Islam rather than Arabs, Middle Easterners, immigrants, or any of the others that are disrupting Western horizons?
Very easy answer is this, that Muslimness has a sort of existence now that it may not have had in the same way 30, 40 years ago. So to give you a very simple example, in Europe, in Germany, you had people who were considered to be Kurds and Turks. In France, you had people who were from Senegal or the Maghreb. In Britain, you had people from Bangladesh and Pakistan, but you had no Muslims. At a certain point, towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, all of these countries began to think about these people are Muslims. So there was a kind of a redefinition from national to ethnic to the notion of Muslimness, which was far more global. And at the same time, in the context of Europe, it was also the attempt to define a pan-European identity. So I think there are these kinds of plays in which the crisis of the nation state is really at the heart of these kinds of attempts. And when you talk about other forms of national identity, at this current conjuncture, they don't have the same kind of transnational reach, which threatens the possibility of the nation state, it seems to me.
Excellent. This is sort of goes back to the institutionalization of this and the production of it. If you sort of flip that on the other side, what are points of intervention to de-racialize Islam, to counter the Islamophobic currents that we see across the globe? What are the points of leverage to, if you truly see this as an institutionalized form, what is the best way to counter it?
I think one of, and they are, will depend on local context, is to kind of expand the kind of framework by which the Islam represented, it's disciplined, it's taught to that. So one of those things it really is to recognize what is at stake here in this kind of what is involved in a type of racism. And a racism isn't simply, it is a form of governance, it's a form of regulation. And that's what needs to be contested. And I think it's a question about asserting the possibility of those who are subjugated populations to have agency and to be able to exercise that agency, to be part of the conversation. And those are kind of practical measures of kind of including them and their concerns within the kind of spectrum of how you think of your, as a community, of your future.
Could I just add something here? I think it's worth bearing in mind that even though we're focusing on Islamophobia, that question that we've just been answering you could substitute anti-blackness for Islamophobia and ask, how do you deracialize that?
Yep.
So that then takes us back to the constitution of the political experience. This is one of the things that I was trying to get at in the last conversation we had when I was talking about white sovereignty, because if there is this idea that white sovereignty is what defines the legitimacy of the political experience, then you begin to see the prohibition of Muslimness, the prohibition of blackness, the prohibition of Asianness, and so on, unless they conform and assimilate to a certain kind of template of what Western civic life is. So we have to get to the roots of how it is that the very idea of what we call political life is actually constituted.
I think that's a really important point, because it, because it really points to the idea that you can't just address Islamophobia in isolation, right? It's not a isolated instance that you can say we get rid of Islamophobia, everything else will stay in place. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was agreeing with you. Look, there are certain measures that you take in context. For example, you can start imagining that Muslims have some kind of agency, or Muslim women have agency, and you may want to listen to them rather than assume that they have no agency. So that's a very kind of minor point. But I think the bigger point that Barnor was making, and I completely agree with, is really perhaps the fundamental issue is not only how we got here, but to try and recognize where we're going. And what we seem to be going towards is the kind of the post-Western. And it's the embrace of the post-Western, not just in cosmetic terms, just in sort of, very kind of minor kind of culturalist terms, but to understand that both epistemologically and politically. And to that, I think, is really the challenge, fundamental challenge, because at the end of the day, all forms of racism, and I think, everything I've said, Islamophobia is a form of racism, is really about whiteness and non-whiteness. And that is the frontier that perhaps we need to think about how to undermine that. And you can't undermine that without recognizing that ultimately racism and colonialism are far, far more similar than they're presented to. One could argue that racism is something simply like colonialism in space. That's the link. And as long as we treat them as two separate things, we have no history or understanding of how we get here. And that means that we have no understanding of how we get out of it.
I think that is, unfortunately, the perfect way to end our hour that we have together. Thank you very much, both of you, for really insightful comments and thoughts, and for answering the questions. There's quite a few more that we haven't gotten to, but we're out of time. I would like to thank everyone who attended for joining us today. The folks who joined in through WebEx can expect to receive a survey, and we hope you give us feedback on how we can improve and enhance and expand our programming. Our next event will be on December 1st, the same time, and we will feature Ian Hurt, who's a professor of political science at Northwestern. We'll look at the promise and limits of international cooperation around peace and justice. Until then, be well, stay healthy, and thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.